Sheila, thanks so much for joining us. And could you just start by introducing yourself a bit, because you've got this amazing history which puts you in pole position in so many things on natural resource management.
Well, that's very kind of you, Paul. I'm not sure that I'm in pole position, but I'll take your word for it. I think it's important to just say I was born and raised in Botswana. And this is important because it speaks to the nature of the product I am, both in terms of my cultural values, but also in terms of my education and how it came to be. I was privileged to see governance through the eyes of industry leaders. But not only that there were 20 companies meant I was operating right through the value chain, from exploration to mining to processing. And so though I wasn't in the technical space, I really got to understand governance and the commercial aspects of mining. But more than that, more than half of these companies were in partnership, either with the Botswana government or juniors. And so that was another privileged position of seeing how multinationals partner with others and how this partnership dynamic. Later on, I was to represent De Beers as the CEO of De Beers in Botswana, which is the company's biggest source of revenue, the biggest source of stocks. At the time, about 60% of De Beers' revenue came from Botswana and about 50% of the entire stock. Put it another way, Paul, if Botswana and De Beers were not in partnership and De Beers didn't have access to Botswana's production, the likelihood is that De Beers' market footprint would have declined from 40 to only 20. That's a big deal in a country about which nobody has ever had. And so there you are. Botswana is and remains an unknown. The exception to the rule was the world of diamonds. And my fortune was to be at the epicenter of this dynamic. But I now serve on boards of listed companies in both NASDAQ, the London stock market, some in minerals and some in oil. And so I've also been fortunate to now move over from minerals into the oil space and into the renewables and non-renewable. So there you are. If that means I'm privileged, then I'm well and truly lucky. But my sense is the jury's still out. But thank you nevertheless for the compliment. It's really lovely to see you.
I want to go back to how Botswana became such a success. After all, with those diamonds, for many years, Botswana became the fastest growing country in the world. And so diamonds became the rocket which transformed Botswana. How did that happen? Because it certainly didn't happen in Sierra Leone. So how did it happen?
So I think if I were to capture it in one word, it's leadership. And it's leadership as in the founding fathers. Because many may not know, but diamonds were discovered exactly 12 months after Botswana acquired self-rule. And so Sereza Khama, Kitumela Masire, and others who were the leaders of the country at the time made one very important decision, which is that wherein up to that point, minerals were vested in the chiefs. They approached the traditional chiefs and said, we ask you to agree with us to change the law such that all of Botswana's underground natural resources are vested in the state and you relinquish your rights. And so they did. I asked our former head of state, Kitumela, why do you think the chief so readily said this? And he said, it is because there was only one chief in the room who had minerals, and it was Sereza Khama, and he was the one asking. So the fellow who was asking had the most to lose, and the fellows who were accepting his ask had everything to gain because they didn't know they had minerals. And so this benevolence, this foresightedness on the part of Sereza Khama to see that you can't form a nation where its biggest wealth is disaggregated through ownership, I think was one of the single most important things. And then, of course, the vision of how to exploit them was another. But I do think we have seen that leadership come through in different ways throughout the years. The latter part of that leadership was really the management of the revenue. So I did not know this, but I learned 20 years ago that actually Botswana doesn't have a mineral revenue management policy. What they have is a habit, but as fate would have it, it's a good habit. Here's the habit. First, all mineral revenue is spent on development projects, non-recurrent. So that was rule one. The second is that having done that, about 42% is in education. 39% is in infrastructure and the rest in health. And they've just been doing this as a matter of budget discipline. So you have leadership not only in the political space, but you have also leadership in the technocratic space. And here, people like former President Mahai are the true champions of leadership in the sense of fiscal policies. And so when I think about this, I think this is what in many ways separates Botswana from other countries, the commitment to do the right thing and the recognition that the resource belong to the state, and then the freedom of the technocrats to exercise their knowledge, to do the right thing without interference from those in power. That I think would be my sense of what went right.
And tell me, your experience was in the private sector. Now, what made Botswana work for the private sector, whereas Sierra Leone didn't work for the private sector? What I mean, we're not talking about Sierra Leone, but why were the mining companies willing to sort of work with the government? Because you ended up with partnership, didn't you?
Yeah. So, I mean, this may not come as good news for some who are critics of the private sector. But one of the laws that is very critical to the manner in which Botswana's mineral resources are exploited is the Minerals Act, which provides that for every discovery, the state has a right to equity. Now, I do have to say that actually, when you look at the entire, say, 53 African states, almost all of them have this provision. So in that sense, Botswana is no exception. But Botswana is unusual in one respect. In most countries, it is carried interest. In Botswana, the state actually has to contribute towards the acquisition of that equity. And so my sense is that for what you pay for, you value. What you pay for, you protect. So it seems that actually having carried interest is beneficial to the state. My experience is the reverse. Actually, what it does is that it devalues the stock because it came for free. So, but let's park that, because your question was, what about the partnership with the private sector? So this law provides for the partnership outright, but then the terms have to be negotiated. So one of the most important things was really the people who were in the room. So if you go back to 1969, when the partnership was formed, it is said that Botswana only had about 15 graduates. So suffice to say, there was no one to negotiate. So actually, the negotiation for this was really between Seretse Khama, Seg Dumile Masire, and Harry Oppenheimer. And there was a certain commitment. Most people don't know this. In truth, Harry was a very liberal, progressive, forward-looking person. And Harry wanted, as Seretse did, a model in Botswana that spoke to post-colonial relationships between governments and investors. And in the partnerships that Anglo American formed at the time in Botswana, in Zambia, and for that matter, in his friendship with the late Julius Nyerere, Harry wanted relationships that spoke to the new order. And so I think there was a meeting of minds. But quite apart from that, he was also a very good businessman, and I think he saw the future. He knew that as South Africa, or rather a mining environment of the type in which De Beers was born in 1888 had no future, and that it was part of his enlightened self-interest that he understood that the future of his company lay in the relationships he formed with the governments on whom he depended for the resource. So there was a certain level of progressiveness in the way that the relationship was struck. And so I think that with this was born an understanding that we will be better off if we do well by each other. And with that, even with negotiations being very difficult, there was an understanding that there was nothing to be gained by the other undermining the interests of their partner. And so the negotiations took place in the understanding that we dare not fail, not in the partnership sense.
So there was a recognition that the two partners were interdependent. They both depended on each other. Anglo De Beers needed the government on side, and the government needed the company to be supportive. And so it was interdependence was recognized, and there was a recognition that there was so much for mutual benefit.
Yes, I think that there really was. But I do have to say that, of course, one must understand De Beers is a very unique company. De Beers is a company that is entirely dependent on diamonds. It has and had been leading the industry for nearly a century. And so De Beers has a different view of relationships because it wins or loses on diamonds, period. And so the stakes tend to be very high. And when the stakes are high, people think hard before they make decisions. And I think Harry understood this. In an anecdote with a former head of state, I asked him how the negotiations were the second time around when Botswana was progressively coming of age and they had made the second discovery. And he said that they had said to Harry, look, Harry, you don't have to mind this. We can find it somewhere else. And Harry said, would you really do that? And he thinks in that instance, when Harry Oppenheimer realized that actually Botswana understood their leverage, the lay of the land changed. And in my observation, the relationship, Paul, has moved from one in which Botswana almost entirely depended on De Beers for technology, marketing expertise, and education, to one in which De Beers is now dependent on Botswana for its very reputation and legacy. This is a big deal. And I'm often very upset when people speak as if Botswana is the underdog. Let me be as clear as I can. Botswana is not the underdog. Botswana was never the underdog. As a matter of fact, with the passage of time, not only has the partnership strengthened, I would argue in certain quarters, Botswana's leverage now outstrips that of De Beers, and Botswana uses it well. And I feel it's an insult to the leadership of Botswana, both on the political and technocratic side, for people to continue to see Botswana as being in a position of being an underdog. Here are the statistics. I have not found, in the many countries I've worked, a company that is in partnership with the state, wherein the state's stake is 91 cents to the dollar. Find me a country that does better than that. It is worth a case study. Here and now, that country is Botswana. And we just have to acknowledge that. It's a fact. And if that doesn't speak to some kind of success in a country's ability to steward these mineral resources and maximize these resources, then, God help us. And we don't, here is another thing. If a relationship lasts 50 years, it is successful, any kind of relationship. If a joint venture relationship lasts 50 years, it's a mega success. And it's not because I say so. It's because a US-based firm called the Water Street Partners that specializes in joint partnerships in natural resources says that most partnerships only last 30 years. And Botswana has lasted 50, and there's no indication it's falling apart. And so I think that when we say Botswana is successful, we can point to a few things without at all suggesting that it is perfect.
Sheila, that was fantastic. Thank you. You covered a lot more than I had intended, but you covered it beautifully. I mean, just beautifully. Is there anything else you want to download on? Because I think that was just great.
One of the things that worries me now going beyond Botswana is this notion that if you look at industry, you are by definition looking at an entity with no good intentions. And that if, on the other hand, you look at governments, you are looking at an entity with no capacity and a victim. I think this narrative ought to change, because what it does is that it does set us for a fall. I relish the prospects that one day industry will be given the benefit of the doubt, and that governments too will be respected for their capacity, knowing the limits of what they can do, and focusing on those, and then externalizing the sourcing of expertise in areas where there is no value in investing in public service knowledge.
The categorization of the private sector as villains and the government and the society as victim is not a very helpful categorization. Sheila, thank you so much. You've got so much wisdom in you. You're very much still needed, and thank you for all that you're doing.
It's a pleasure, Paul.